Freedom of navigation, the legal principle that states ships from any country have the right to sail freely in international waters, is under attack, and it has been for some time. But a confluence of geopolitical shifts, security threats, and an accelerating frequency of legal assaults are finally starting to erode a fundamental principle of the law of the sea, and a pillar of modern international law with it. For the first time since the Cold War, maritime trade lanes have become contested zones, and the rules-based order that shipping has previously relied on to protect it has started to disintegrate. And that threat is coming from multiple vectors. Now, before we start exploring some of the detail there, I should point out that this is the second edition of this podcast series. So if you haven't already listened to part 1, I would heartily recommend that you go back and start there before continuing here. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everybody still listening is up to speed on the fact that we have an extraordinary and unusual series of physical threats to shipping, curtailing the ability of ships to transit key trade lanes. But having focused in the last episode on the Red Sea, I want to switch our attention to what's happening in the Baltic. And that's because I want to tackle the interplay between the established legal principles of the law of the sea and the geopolitical and legal challenges to it. And a good starting point for that is what's happening in the Baltic right now. Last week, the Danish government presented its global strategy for maritime security. Now, as you would expect, there's a lot of talk in there about how they are protecting the freedom of navigation. The Danes, along with most of the other Baltic state governments, are deeply concerned about the safety, environmental and security risks being posed by the so-called dark fleet. They're also, understandably, more than a little concerned about the recent spate of cable-cutting antics. But what can they do to protect themselves from these risks that are being posed, and how far can they go in challenging the ships that they consider to be a threat without being themselves considered a direct challenge to the freedom of navigation that they profess to be upholding?
Is it still possible to sail in the Baltic? Well, it is. Will it continue to be so? Well, in peacetime, it will. Are we challenging the concepts of freedom of navigation there right now? In my opinion, no. But are we doing different things, or at least saying we're going to start doing different things? Yes, we are. For example, this idea that we'd like to see that there is actually a valid insurance certificate before you enter the Baltic, or for example also the channel, the British Channel. Is that a new thing? Yes, it's a new request. But is it new law? Not necessarily, it just hasn't been done before. And of course, it does mean that when you're doing something new in a situation where things are tense, that will also get interpreted into that context.
That's Professor Kristin Sig, who you will have heard in our first episode, and she's the leading academic voice on the law of the sea, and her point there stems from the often misinformed public debate currently happening in the Baltic states. Theoretically, if pollution control regulations are not adhered to, and this threatens to cause major damage to the marine environment, then a coastal state could take appropriate enforcement measures. But that's never really been tried and tested. And in the context of sanctions and the threat of Russian naval escorts being deployed through European waters to stave off suggestions from politicians that dark fleet tankers may be blockaded, well, it's going to be a very brave politician that tries to use UNCLOS as a justification for a potential naval conflict. So why are we seeing anonymous officials leaking details to the likes of the Financial Times saying that Denmark will be given the task of inspecting and potentially blocking tankers carrying Russian oil from sailing through its waters under new EU plans? Well, in international law, the line between diplomacy, state practice, and law is often more blurred than we might like to think, and it is a surprisingly elastic concept. What Denmark and the Nordic-Baltic states have said is that they would take, quote, coordinated steps to disrupt and deter Russia's shadow fleet. While that language is deliberately vague, this amounts to politely requesting details of suspect ships' insurance. And if they don't comply, then they risk being sanctioned. But so far, none of the states are suggesting that they will go beyond that, for now at least.
There are provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention that would indicate that the coastal state has a competence, firstly within the territorial sea, the first 12 nautical miles, which is about 22 kilometers, but also it is clear that what comes after that, the exclusive economic zone, it is very clear, and that we can read that out of the provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention, that we realize that that area is not fully regulated. It's sort of black letter rules. We realize that we have made sort of a bit of a pick and mix regulation there. There's a little bit of environment. There's a little bit of, well, high sea regulation, slavery, and unauthorized broadcasting and all sorts of horrible things that can happen out there are still illegal out there. It's not a lawless space, but we have just not in the Law of the Sea conventions or in other regulations set a very sort of dense regulation that says this is okay, this is not. And that means that when we're out there, we fall back until proven differently on the flag state principle that we pretend it's almost like the high seas and you have this freedom of navigation. But now saying, okay, we ask for a certificate that you have the compulsory, I'd like to stress, by law, compulsory insurance you need to have if you're a tanker, an oil tanker. There is indications to the way I read it, and in 10 years, the Law of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg might tell me I was wrong. But the way I read it, yes, we have some legislative powers. We certainly have some legislative powers when it comes to environment. Ships are certainly expected to actually live up to the conventions that apply to them. And we have to remember that most of the vessels that are out there, maybe they're in quite new flag states, but most of the flag states, they actually accept that there needs to be an insurance certificate, and it will normally be convention-based under the CLC Convention. So for the freedom for you to avail yourself of the freedom of navigation, we have actually, as coastal states, the right to expect you to live up to certain minimum standards. So, of course, finally, if we have a vessel that is sailing through there and we say, can we please see an insurance certificate? And they say no, well, let's just play that situation out. Let's assume it's a bona fide vessel that is trading Russian oil. And we have to remember that we don't want them to do it, but under their own law, that is not illegal. And that also under UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, we can't say you can't sail here just because we don't like your cargo unless it's actually dangerous. Oil is not dangerous as long as it's on the tanker. Let's just play that out, though. The ship is required to have this insurance certificate. So if it's a bona fide transport that doesn't want to show us the insurance certificate, and there's actually a buyer in the other end, and we say, well, then we would want you to stop sailing. If you're a merchant, that is just not making sense. So if you are only there for commercial reasons, you will either just send a picture on your phone, your coastal near, so you can do that, of your insurance certificate, and off you go. So if you don't want to do that, let's just play that out. Is it likely that you are there only for commercial reasons? That is just my own, that is what I would think if I were a coastal state. And I would get concerned, maybe from a security perspective also, there is some issues with pipelines, but I would also get concerned out of environmental reasons and say, well, then we are afraid that nobody would insure you, that you are now in such a poor safety you are now so substandard, yet you couldn't even find one P&I club to insure you. You know what, we'll just come and say hi. I'm sure you're okay with that. So that is how I assume that would play out.
It's fair to say that not all politicians are quite so informed about the legal nuances of UNCLOS as Professor Sig. We've seen various statements from Baltic politicians understandably incensed by the threat posed by a parallel fleet operating outside of the rules-based order that ensures basic safety standards. Meanwhile, you now have NATO states trying to fund increased security in the wake of recent damage to subsea cables, apparently caused by ships dragging their anchors. Now, we have an issue here, and I need to stress that when we're talking about dark fleet and cable cutting, we are in fact talking about two separate issues. What I've noticed in a lot of the commentary is that there are two issues being merged and conflated here. And actually, if you're going to try and interdict these ships, it is two very different legal bases that you need to look at. We need to separate out the two. But in a world of politicians, I'm afraid all this adds up into much the same thing, and that means that something must be done. Here is something, let's do it. And that's why you see episodes like where we have the Estonian defense minister unilaterally declaring in an interview that shipping companies will need to be taxed to pay for increased security. Some of the political responses have been more nuanced, but there is an underlying concern here that Baltic states may inadvertently end up undermining the freedom of navigation that they are seeking to protect if they don't tread carefully. Here's Ian Rowby, Chief Executive of the consultancy IR Consilium, who you will remember from episode 1.
This two quoque issue is historically a problem for NATO and others in the maritime space. It was in the Second World War that when charged with committing unrestricted total submarine warfare, Admiral Dönitz of the German Navy said, unfortunately, you also, tu quoque, you did the exact same thing, so you can't charge me with something you did. And that's something we have to be very careful about. So, for example, we're very, I think, energized about the notion of the Houthis having tribute payments, and how is that fundamentally different than tax? And we have to be careful. We're not viewing things through such a self-serving lens that we miss how we may be falling afoul of the same principles we're trying to protect. So I think with the Baltic, one of the things that is challenging, one of the problems that we have is that the law is a bit unhelpful, to be honest, on submarine cable protection. We are now so heavily reliant on this infrastructure of 420 or so privately owned cables the size of a garden hose sitting on the ocean floor, and yet the law, the most extensive law on them, dates to 1884 when they were telegraph cables, and there are only a few provisions in UNCLOS that even mention them, most of which is focused on flag states criminalizing the use of one of their flag vessels to damage or disrupt the cable. And so there's very little on what a coastal state can do outside of 12 and certainly outside of 24 to protect the submarine cable infrastructure on which they're so heavily reliant. And that void, that gap between 1982's UNCLOS and today's world reality is essentially what is being targeted. And so we have to be careful that our approach to resolving that gap isn't to violate another principle that we hold dear, and that is the freedom of navigation. And so it is a bit of a balancing act that requires pretty careful thinking. And the Baltic has been under such intense pressure. It's unsurprising that they would be looking to options that sound appealing, but may not be fully thought through in terms of the long-term implications of them.
Now, I want to switch focus slightly, but stay with that legal context, because the law of the sea that we are referring to here is in itself under attack. It's not just the Houthi rockets or the cable-cutting antics of the Dark Fleet that we should be concerned about. Arguably, the larger threat comes in the form of a legal and diplomatic war that is being waged to redefine the very concept of international rules that allow ships to trade internationally. We touched on this briefly in the first episode, but there are multiple different examples to support the argument that both China and Russia are systematically trying to undermine the foundational elements of the law of the sea. And in doing so, they're threatening to return the global maritime domain to a state of instability, divided down worryingly vague borders of national interest and security. Here's Ian again.
I think there's something that's happening that we aren't necessarily paying attention to. So there are 4 official sources of international law: treaties and conventions, and that's the biggest one. That's the strongest one. And so UNCLOS is in that category of big, strong international law. The second one is customary international law, which is state practice done over a long period of time with a sense of obligation, and that's how we get international custom, and so it becomes legally binding, even though there's nothing written down to say that that's what has to happen. The third is the law of individual states, and so if a whole bunch of states have the same maritime law, we are always applying the uniformity and universality principle of trying to make maritime law look the same everywhere, and so that's the sort of third big category. The fourth, though, has been, I think, a target of China in particular, because it is very clear that China is essentially trying to make new international law through that fourth one, which is, on the one hand, the opinions of international courts and tribunals, which they do not like, but on the other, the opinions, the writings, the speeches of recognized quote unquote experts. And the problem with this is that we've blurred the definition or understanding of what constitutes recognized expertise at this point. And so China has funded so much academic literature through so many publications that they are overwhelming the volume of literature on different legal topics with their view, their approach. And this is true both of traditional issues that we might actually want to discuss because they've been legal issues for a while, but also issues that have never been addressed before. For example, what are the territorial rights that accrue when you have a historical shipwreck somewhere for fishing, and their whole fishing grounds as the basis for the 9-line claim expanded globally, creates a pretty worrying picture of what other territories they might start to claim in the maritime space as sovereignty outside of national jurisdiction becomes more and more of a thing. So they are essentially creating new international law through this volume of publication at their behest, at their funding, at their direction. But that also comes up with another new challenge, which is they are also aware of how the AI platforms that a lot of people are turning to for information and understanding work. And so when you ask a legal question on some of these platforms, you're going to get, by virtue of the volume that they have produced, the answer that China wants. And so that is how they are essentially remaking UNCLOS and gaps in UNCLOS fit their own take. And so that's a kind of a different way of limiting freedom of navigation by essentially erasing the understanding of it and replacing it with their own interpretation.
I suspect there are many of you out there listening to me jump from the Houthi threat to the Baltic to the Dark Fleet and Chinese legal assaults on UNCLOS, asking whether this is really adding up to much. And I agree, we are dealing with several very distinct issues here, but I would argue that this does all add up to a singular threat that needs to be taken much more seriously than it is currently. We accept the erosion of the rules-based order that has underpinned globalized maritime trade for decades at our peril. Geopolitical tensions are deepening and global maritime trade is being caught in the crossfire, both literally and figuratively. Freedom of navigation is under attack. Trade lanes on the oceans are contested zones for the first time since the Cold War. The question is whether there is now sufficient energy left amongst those backing the crumbling rules-based order to defend it. And that is the debate that I'm interested in. It's an open question for now, but one that we will be pursuing from different angles on this podcast. So, as ever, get in touch and agree or disagree as you will. I would love to hear from you either way. Richard.mead@lloydslistintelligence.com is the best way to get me, or you will find me occasionally on LinkedIn, possibly Twitter if I can stomach it. Thanks for listening. We will be back with you again next week for more of the stories shaping shipping. For now, though, goodbye.